but as fellow parents and grandparents and as concerned neighbors. It's back to school time for America's children, and while drug and alcohol abuse cuts across all generations, it's especially damaging to the young people on whom our future depends. So tonight, from our family to yours, from our home to yours, thank you for joining us. America has accomplished so much in these last few years, whether it's been rebuilding our economy or serving the cause of freedom in the world. What we've been able to achieve has been done with your help, with us working together as a nation united. Now, we need your support again. Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children. From the beginning of our administration, we've taken strong steps to do something about this horror. Tonight, I can report to you that we've made much progress. 37 federal agencies are working together in a vigorous national effort. And by next year, our spending for drug law enforcement will have more than tripled from its 1981 levels. We have increased seizures of illegal drugs. Shortages of marijuana are now being reported. Last year alone, over 10,000 drug criminals were convicted, and nearly $250 million of their assets were seized by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. And in the most important area...
All right, folks, we are back.
In 4 years...
It is 7:37 in the PM here on February the 9th, 2024. Oh my God. Yes, the future is here. This is Issues and Answers Friday, My Country with Scott Cannon. And that was the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Wilson Reagan, talking about his strategy in the war on drugs. As we established in the last segment before the Happy Happies, the war on drugs was started to give the government the opportunity to destroy and disrupt black communities. And that's the effect that it's had. So what we're going to do is continue looking at the rise and legacy of one of America's greatest villains, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Now, in 1980, Ronald Reagan actually emerged as a viable candidate because of the unpopularity of Jimmy Carter at that time. Reagan was a very vocal critic of President Carter. He was critical of the Panama Canal treaties signing and the oil crisis and the rise of inflation and interest and unemployment rates. All of these things helped sort of guide the way for a Reagan presidency. His announcement stressed that his fundamental principles of tax cuts to stimulate the economy and having both a small government and a strong national defense, since he believed that the United States was behind the Soviet Union militarily. In the primaries, he did suffer an unexpected loss to George H.W. Bush, not George W. Bush, but George H.W. Bush, the Daddy Bush. But he had easily captured the presidential nomination and ended up choosing Daddy Bush as his running mate in the Detroit convention in July. And on November 4th, 1980, Ronald Reagan won a very, very decisive victory in the Electoral College over Jimmy Carter, winning 44 states and receiving 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49 in 6 states and the District of Columbia. So that was pretty much a blowout. What a lot of people don't know is that in 1980, Ronald Reagan actually started his campaign. His first speech he gave was in Philadelphia, Mississippi. That was the speech I played at the beginning of the last segment. Philadelphia, Mississippi was special because that's where 3 civil rights workers had been murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in 1964. Ronald Reagan given a states' rights speech right where those civil rights workers had been murdered was thought to be some sort of a coded message, or at least symbolic, that yeah, this guy is going to have a certain sensibility when it comes to dealing with race, and we were ultimately right. Now, one of the main features of the Reagan presidency was Reaganomics. Yes, the pillar of Reagan's economic policy included increasing defense spending, balancing the federal budget, and slowing growth of government spending, reducing the federal income tax and capital gains tax, reducing government regulations, and tightening the money supply in order to reduce inflation. He lifted federal oil and gasoline price controls. And he signed the Economic Recovery Tax Act to dramatically lower federal income tax rates and require exemptions and brackets to be indexed for inflation starting in 1985. By 1983, the amount of federal tax had fallen for all or most taxpayers, but mostly among the rich. That's why they love Reagan so much. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 reduced the number of tax brackets and the top rate and almost doubled personal exemptions. Now, critics labeled this trickle-down economics, the belief that tax policies that benefit the rich will spread to the poor. He also approved plans to cut Social Security, but had to back off due to public backlash. He signed amendments to both raise the program's payroll taxes and entire retirement age for benefits. And he had signed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981 to cut funding for federal assistance such as food stamps, unemployment benefits, subsidized housing, and aid to families with dependent children. I always have to remind people that when you see cuts to welfare, the overwhelming majority of people who suffer from that are children. Children are the ones who suffer. You think you're punishing the parents. No, you're punishing the children. That's what you're doing. Now, on the other side, defense spending doubled between 1981 and 1985. He also sought to loosen federal regulations of economic activities, and he appointed key officials who shared this agenda. In 1982, the Garn-St. Germain Depository Institutions Act deregulated savings and loan associations by letting them make a variety of loans and investments outside of real estate. Now, after this bill's passage, savings and loans associated engaged in riskier activities, and the leaders of some institutions embezzled the funds. The administration's inattentiveness towards that industry contributed to the savings and loan crisis and ended up costing the American public billions. The financial deregulation and changes to the tax code that Reagan enacted cost nearly 750 financial institutions to fail and cost the taxpayers about $150 billion. By 1986, the Reagan administration eliminated almost half of the federal regulations that had existed in 1981. The national debt tripled between the years 1980 and 1989. The national debt as a percentage of the GDP rose from 33% to 53% by 1989. During his time in office, he never fulfilled his promise of submitting a balanced budget. The United States borrowed heavily to cover the newly spawned federal budget deficits. Ultimately, the wealth never trickled down, folks. It never trickled down. And wages for lower and middle class Americans didn't really rise at all and have not in the 40 years since. I did the story last year about how the super rich are getting so rich that we're about to have a trillionaire. But wages for lower and middle class Americans have not risen since the Reagan era. Income inequality became significantly worse during the Reaganomics years, at least partly leading to the 1% situation we're in right now. You can say that again. So we see Reaganomics were basically steal from the poor to give to the rich. It was the sort of reverse Robin Hood situation. Now, Reagan was disastrous for organized labor. In 1981, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, or PATCO, went on strike, violating a federal law prohibiting government unions from striking. On August 3rd, Reagan said he would fire air traffic controllers if they did not return to work, and within 48 hours. And according to him, 38% did not return. On August the 13th, Reagan fired roughly 12,000 striking air traffic controllers who ignored this order. Now, thanks to this and his sympathetic National Labor Relations Board's appointees, many companies also won wage and benefit cutbacks from unions, especially in the manufacturing sector. During Reagan's presidency, the share of employees who were part of a labor union dropped. It's about 7%. You know why wages have stopped increasing around the time Reagan was in office for the working class? Yeah, it's because of that. Now, we talked earlier about Reagan opposing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But don't worry, in his administration, he sought to outdo his mistakes. Early in his presidency, he elected Clarence M. Pendleton Jr., known for his opposition to affirmative action and equal pay for men and women, as the chair of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, despite the fact that this man had hostility towards civil rights in general. Pendleton and Reagan's subsequent appointees greatly eroded the enforcement of civil rights law, and ultimately we see the effects throughout the 80s. We saw a lot of the gains of the civil rights movement were erased. Now, we talked about it earlier, but the war on drugs. Ronald Reagan intensified the war on drugs in 1982. The FBI, the DEA, and the U.S. Department of Defense all increased their anti-drug funding by a lot. He signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and 1988 to specify penalties for drug offenses, and both of these bills since then have been criticized for promoting huge racial disparities in incarceration. When Reagan took office in 1980, the prison population was 329,000, and when he left office 8 years later, it had doubled. This staggering rise in mass incarceration affected black communities the hardest. He also escalated the Cold War. He ordered a massive defense buildup because he was afraid of the Soviet Union. He introduced the SDI, the Star Wars defense program, that he thought was going to help protect against any strikes from other nations, particularly the Soviet Union. Now, the scientific community thought it was absolutely ridiculous. He sent aid covertly to the Afghani Mujahideen when they were fighting the Soviets, but that led to blowback in the form of the Taliban that ended up, as we all know, being involved in protecting Osama bin Laden after the 9/11 attacks. He also armed Saddam Hussein's Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, despite the fact that it was widely known that Iraq was using chemical weapons on civilians. And throughout the Reagan doctrine, his administration supported so many anti-communist movements and ended up committing so much violence in places like Nicaragua and other Latin American countries. He invaded Grenada in 1983 to distract from the fact that Marines had been killed 241 Marines had been killed in Beirut. He invaded this country and helped overthrow its government because they were sympathetic to the Soviet Union and Cuba. Good Lord. He was slow to respond to the AIDS epidemic. When the AIDS epidemic started in 1981, Ronald Reagan ignored it for 7 years. He didn't even really think about it until his friend Rock Hudson died, and even then he still didn't mention it for another year after that. What's even worse is that our government refused to acknowledge that a lot of people who had AIDS were infected by a medication that hemophiliacs needed to live. That's how Ryan White got it, the young man from here in Indiana who became a cause celeb back in the 80s. He got it from a blood clotting medication. As early as 1983, the CDC suspected AIDS might be spreading through blood plasma products. They held a meeting with members of the pharmaceutical industry, which ended with someone from the CDC pounding his fist on the table and asking, how many people have to die before we do something? The White House didn't even bother to look into it. Reagan supported apartheid South Africa. He called Nelson Mandela a terrorist. After the 1984, Ronald Reagan met with Desmond Tutu, who described Reagan's administration as an unmitigated disaster for blacks and called Reagan himself a racist, pure and simple. We know now about the Iran-Contra affair, where we talked about how Reagan did anything possible to try to stop the Soviets from getting a foothold here in the Americas. And so Reagan funded the Contras in Nicaragua, who were brutal death squads and ended up killing thousands and thousands of people. And not only that, oh no, that's not all. They actually ended up killing so many of us in our community by bringing drugs en masse from Nicaragua, these Nicaraguan drug cartels being funded by the Contras. They helped spur the crack epidemic. He also made homelessness worse. How did he do that? He signed an act which made forced institutionalization or medication of people who might be suffering from mental illness significantly more difficult. And this led to a huge spike in homelessness in California. And when he became president, he actually brought this policy nationwide. And so when you see the amount of homeless people and mentally ill people you see walking around the streets of Gary and everywhere else, a lot of that is because of Ronald Reagan and the gutting of the mental health systems that he made as the governor of California and then as president of the United States. He brought the religious right, the dishonest, disingenuous, the Pat Robertsons, the Jerry Falwell, who brought a certain level of right-wing, fascistic, white supremacy to their religious ideologies, opposing the rights of women and other groups of people. And on top of that, his administration was arguably the most corrupt ever. During his time in office, 138 members of his team were investigated, indicted, or convicted for their roles in various scandals. Folks, I think we could say without certainty, I didn't even get to finish all the horrible things I wanted to say about Ronald Reagan. We ran out of time. That's how much horrible stuff he did. The fairness doctrine, financialization of the economy. Oh, just so much crap comes from Reagan. I think it's safe to say Ronald Reagan is definitely one of America's greatest villains.